Hey, what's up? This is Twisted Mind, and you're watching the First Look series, an overview of the changes made to your class going into the Mists of Pandaria. Paladins can either provide their raid with a 5% stat boost through their Blessing of Kings, or they can use the new Blessing of Might, which now gives a mastery boost to the raid. Prot and Ret Paladins can provide the weakened blows with their Hammer of the Righteous ability. And Ret Paladins can provide the 4% debuff to physical vulnerability with their Judgment. Paladins will notice that they no longer have a bar or auras. Instead, some of those have been baked into abilities, and in its place is now a bar that holds all of your seals. The intent here is to make seals a little bit more flexible and part of the gameplay instead of a just buff that you put up and forget about. You'll see here that Seal of Truth does more single target damage, Seal of Righteousness is for AoE damage, and the Seal of Insight is for your healing/survivability and mana recovery. The Devotion Aura spell is trying to fill the gap in our toolkit where Aura Mastery and Divine Guardian used to be. Divine Protection by default gives 40% magic reduced damage taken, however you can glyph it back to the old way, which it did 20% physical and 20% magical. And your Rebuke is now on a 15-second cooldown to match the other melee interrupts. To replace Crusader Aura, Paladins now have a speed increase on their mounts, but it doesn't include your group members. Paladins also got a tweak to their Holy Power. Essentially now you can store up to 5 charges, up from the previous 3. However, every time you use an ability that dumps Holy Power, it'll cap at dumping 3 per ability. So essentially what this means is more flexibility in your rotation and pooling Holy Power together. It also means we can get trickier with our Holy Power dump combos, as we can do a 3 Holy Power dump followed by a 2 immediately if we pool it up to 5 charges. Managing those new 5 charges is going to be especially important for Prot, but I'll get to that in a second. Your rotation should feel familiar if you played Prot throughout Cataclysm. One little note here is that with the addition of the Seals bar and the different abilities that Seals now do, it's not always clear-cut which one you should be in full time. If you're doing a single target fight, you need that threat, Seal of Truth is your answer. If you need to do AoE, Seal of Righteousness is what you should switch into. And if you're having trouble staying alive, or the rest of your group is having trouble staying alive, flip on the Seal of Insight. Changing between these almost stances doesn't do anything for your threat, so it's a new interactive gameplay that's been thrown into your kit. You have the same basic pull your Holy Power with buttons and then dump them with Holy Power dumps. Your buttons that you have to choose from are Crusader Strike for single target, your Hammer of the Righteousness for AoE. These both share a cooldown like they did in Cataclysm, so it's either one, either or, but Hammer of the Righteousness does take priority first in your rotation because it applies the weakened blows debuff, and then your Judgment as well has been thrown in, and Judgment is now extra critical to keep on cooldown because it generates a charge of Holy Power. You still have the Captain America shield, which also generates a charge of Holy Power if you get the proc Grand Crusader. Prot lost access to the Divine Plea and the 3-charge Holy Power instant, and Exorcism, but it got to keep Holy Wrath and it got to keep Consecrate, and these are both things that you should weave into your rotation in between your Holy Power generation and dumps, even on a single target fight. I noticed that your mana fluctuates quite a bit depending on how you build your Pally through Talents, but I'll get to that in a bit. So essentially if you're dumping mana, you want to be careful with how often you use either one of these abilities, because they can you if you're not careful. Also check out the cool glyph that I just stuck on Consecrate. If you always wanted that to be Death and Decay like, you can now glyph for it. In between the frantic playstyle, though, of Holy Power generation and dumps, I kind of found it hard to do unless we were doing 5-man's trash. Now let's check out your dump. Shield of the Righteousness, as you'll see now, you can dump it with your 3 Holy Power, and this is now the active mitigation that all tanks play with that you're going to be using. Essentially, you activate it and you get a temporary buff that increases your block, and it reduces your damage taken, so maximizing this uptime is key to taking less damage and staying alive as a Pally going forward. Also note that it gives a small little stacking buff for your next Word of Glory. This buff can stack up to 5 times, and it's a linear percentage of 20, 40, 60, 80, 100%. And also note that there is a change. When you pull your Holy Power and dump it on yourself, it doesn't give you a shield if it caps over your health and goes into overhealing, so it's extra critical to press your Word of Glory when you actually want it to be a fully 100% effective heal. The playstyle, roughly speaking, feels like you're trying to pull Holy Power and keep this Shield of the Righteousness as close to 3 on cooldown and 100% uptime as possible, and then waiting and waiting to see if you can use Holy Power and trying to use it at its maximum efficiency of 5 stacks. Something else that's kind of cool if you do fall behind is there are abilities that allow you to soup up your holy power generation really fast, and Word of Glory doesn't have a cooldown anymore, so you can essentially spam it back on yourself. Though its healing has been tuned, assuming you have at least 3 or so charges for effectiveness. Your proc mastery is still block chance and absorption, but keep in mind now that this is on a separate roll, and it also shares diminishing returns like the other 2 avoidance rolls, because Blizzard doesn't want you to cap out on avoidance like you have in previous expansions if you're a shield class. What this means down the road is at a certain high level, it'll be more beneficial to start gemming stamina again, or maybe even haste. In addition to your existing baseline, as soon as you spec prot, you'll get Ardent Defender back, and you'll also get your Guardian of Ancient Kings tuned down to a 3-minute cooldown, and it does a 50% reduction to be in line with the other tank classes. Your level 90 talents open up some doors for some new cooldowns that have the pally flavor of either healing you or your group. The 75 tier opens up some really interesting doors. If you like proccing of Holy Power, sometimes you can generate some freebies with this Sanctified Wrath talent. It can lead to some interesting split-second decisions in the heat of battle. A separate cooldown that you can soup up is on your Avenging Wrath, you can make your judgments 50% of their normal duration. What that means is that Judgment now takes priority over Crusader Strike or Hammer of the Righteousness in your rotation when Avenging Wrath is going, if you have this talent. Your 45 tier also gets a little tricky with your Eternal Flame or your Sacred Shield. Note that after testing Bastion of Defense, which is the buff that gets applied from your Shield of the Righteousness, doesn't actually improve the hot portion of Eternal Flame, but it does improve, so like you can't soup it up with a super hot with your Word of Glory dumps. And Sacred Shield is also a little weird. It's like a buff that lasts on you, and the shield that it provides will refresh like every 6 seconds. So it's not like a consistent shield, but it is something that you can maintain 100% uptime on, but early simming shows the shield is fairly weak. Ret Pally's got a few tweaks in both the rotation and their abilities. You still want to be in Seal of Truth if you're doing single target, and you want to be in Righteousness if there's any AoE. And if you're familiar from the previous expansion with how Holy Powder's generated, it's still pretty much the same Crusader Strike spam for single target. However, you should be using your Hammer of the Righteousness if you are doing any AoE. Also note that all these abilities are scaling with weapon damage now and are more physical than magical. Mastery is the trigger that triggers how much magical damage is going out per Holy Power. And also note there's some pretty sweeping changes to Exorcism. For one, this is the only spec that has it, and two, it's on a cooldown and it generates Holy Power. Art of War procs will still reset the cooldown on it, but it's always an instant cast, so pretty much you want to mash this button as often as possible and as quickly as that Art of War proc can bring it back off cooldown. Also, I hope you like that Tier 13 bonus because it pretty much got baked into Judgment, because Judgment now also generates Holy Power. So Holy Power is a lot more free-flowing in the Ret rotation going into this next expansion. However, note that Consecration and Holy Wrath are both not in the rotation anymore, as we don't get it when we spec it. For Holy Power dumps, you still want to dump it into Templar's Verdict, and you want to also dump it into Inquisition. You want to try to maintain that 100% Inquisition uptime, which is key. But also notice that your Divine Storm now is the Holy Power dump version of an AoE, so it's no longer a Holy Power generator, it's a Holy Power dump, and it should be substituted in for Templar's Verdict in the rotation if there's any AoE. Also note the rotation changed slightly because Inquisition's timing is a little different now. It's a 10-second duration per combo point, so it's a 30-second duration if you blow it at 3. However, there is a glyph that can lengthen the duration by 50%, but it reduces the passive bonus that it gives us. And also note that crit is now attached to it. Your cooldowns has also changed a little bit going into this next expansion. For one, your Avenging Wrath, which remember is a baseline, is 3 minutes, remains a 3-minute baseline as soon as you spec Ret. And what that means is we're not 2-minute wonders anymore, because also you don't get Zealotry as a baseline. Zealotry technically is still in the game and it's called Holy Avenger, but it's a 75 talent that you'll have to pick. Your Guardian of the Ancient Kings remains unchanged at a 5-minute cooldown, does the same stacking mechanics that it had in Cataclysm. Level 75 tiers, what's going to flip up your gameplay as a Ret Pally going forward. Zealotry is now called Holy Avenger. You can choose that, or you can get more burst with Sanctified Wrath during your Avenging Wrath. And last I checked, I think early sims were saying that that wasn't as good of a DPS, but it is pretty situational for PvP. Or you could pick Divine Purpose, which will randomize your Holy Power generation. Level 90 talents are still in a heavy state of flux, so time will tell which one proves to be like the best for DPS, but for now just pick your flavor, and do note that none of these actually scale with your mastery. Now speaking of DAT mastery, It's still your top spec, or your still secondary stat. After expertise, you want to stack mastery. However, there is now a theoretical soft haste cap in the game, and this is all due to the haste scaling of Sanctity of Battle. Essentially what this means is, like, you can theoretically reach a soft cap where you'll have a perfect fluid rotation, where you won't be, your holy power generation will perfectly match your dumps, and I don't know what this number is. The theory crafters are hard at work with it, but essentially that's what you're going to be looking for going forward, is the soft haste cap. This also means going forward that the Divine Purpose talent is theoretically the one that's going to scale the best, although time will tell, because the controlled burst from Holy Avenger is hard to shrug off. And if that wasn't confusing enough for you, check out what's going on with your Word of Glory in this spec through glyphs. With the Glyph of Harsh Words and the Glyph of Word of Glory, this spell actually does become like a viable DPS Holy Power dump. However, due to the way of mastery scaling, your Templar's Verdict will be the primary nuke that you want to dump into, although this does lead to some interesting decisions while playing your new gameplay. Theoretically, and I'm speculating here, if you can line up a Templar's Verdict with your buff that's placed on you from your Word of Glory, then theoretically that should be a DPS gain, assuming that you were able to dump both at 3 stacks. But you only have 6 seconds to fit it in that window. And this is pretty easy to obtain under effects like your Zealotry or during your burst phases, but outside of the burst it would mean that you would have to do some sort of pseudo-rotation where you're pooling your holy power to try to do a double dump, or you'll have to wait for all of your cooldowns to line up at once so you can dump all 3 holy power generating abilities. I haven't gotten it to do a DPS gain yet over my standard rotation, but it's something to keep in the back of your mind. For PvP, I wouldn't recommend it because it neuters the power that your Word of Glory has, which means you're neutering your personal survivability, and you already have enough burst in PvP. And hey, speaking of PvP, in addition to your Hand of Freedom, you also now get a spell called Emancipate, which will free you from movement pairing effects. Holy also got a few tweaks going forward. When you do spec it, you will gain Divine Light and your Holy Light as your bread and butter spells. And note that Flash of Light is now the only spell that's available to the other 2 specs. And you'll also get Holy Shock back, but here's the thing with Holy Shock. I was hoping it would scale with your haste, but it's still fixed at a 6-second cooldown no matter what, and it also appears to have lost some value in crit with that elimination of some of those talents and the glyph, so it's not going to crit as often. But something to think about for Holy Power generation is you do keep Crusader Strike, which does scale with haste. You gain Light of Dawn as a Holy Power dump in addition to your Word of Glory. It remains unchanged and you can still glyph for it like you did in the last expansion. Holy Radiance also saw a change. Its healing is a little bit tweaked down. It still generates 1 combo point charge for your Holy Power, but it doesn't do a hot anymore. It's just like all up front, and it also now is the ability that will always guarantee a proc of Daybreak. Remember, Daybreak before was a chance to do that double Holy Shock. Now what it does is it empowers your next Holy Shock to do AoE healing, so it has a little bit more synergy like the whole toolkit does. However, that means that your Holy Power generation also went down a little bit. But not all hope is lost. Tower of Radiance is still in the game, so you still have that as an access to Holy Power. And I did notice a retuning of the mana cost slightly to your Holy Radiance, so that's also not as punishing to use, but gear and time will tell. Also, your Beacon of Light now costs no mana and it lasts indefinitely on whatever target you place it on. It can also be glyphed to be taken off the global cooldown, so it's not just for tanks anymore. Your Cleanse got the same treatment as the other Dispels. It's now on an 8-second cooldown and it clears all of your diseases and poisons and when you spec Holy Magic. And there's some interesting decisions being made in the world of glyphs for your playstyle. For one, if you hated the Divine Plea being a neutering to your healing while it was active, you can actually glyph for it now to have a cast time, so you do 5 seconds of no healing, but then it front loads all of that mana back. It's personal preference which one to use. And also, your Glyph of Illumination is also seeing some theory crafting, scratching heads. I won't get into the nitty-gritty, but basically if you glyph for it, you're trying to value crit over your spirit. And since mana's tight at the beginning of the expansion, it's not a bad idea to glyph Lay of Hands, although note now it changes it to a 12-minute cooldown for that mana back. And the glyph Flash of Light will also change up your playstyle a little bit if you choose. It kind of functions like Grace that Disc Priests have to deal with, but if you like the playstyle, it has a lot of synergy with your Selfless Healer talent. And keep in mind now that your Judgment is now like subject to your haste levels. But the drawbacks are Judgment no longer gives you that heal or does anything for your mana, and you have to be in a really close range because it's fixed. Your level 45 tier is what's going to flip up your gameplay in terms of talents. I already talked a little bit about the Selfless Healer talent, but Eternal Flame is very viable for Holy Paladins, and early testing in beta is showing that this is the one that's pulling the most healing per second. However, healing per second done is not the end-all be-all of an encounter, so don't discredit the other two. Sacred Shield is still very viable and great talent. Yeah, so keep the encounters in mind when you're choosing your particular talents. Your level 60 tier provides some pretty cool utility, but it's not game-breaking whatever you choose. Or maybe it'll break the game in PvP. And level 75 screws with your holy power generation just like it does the other specs. If you like the randomness from your Word of Glories, you can still spec that with Divine Purpose. You can soup up your holy power generation during Avenging Wrath, or you can get a brand new cooldown because it's essentially Zealotry. And the level 90 talents are still in flux for Holy because they're doing some radical out-of-control healing right now on beta, so expect those values, whatever they are now, to be changed. If you heard the rumors of Shakadin coming back, it's because of all of these glyphs, but it's not intended to be a DPS spec, and it's not intended to break PvP either, so don't read too much into it. And do note that Denounce is the holy version of Exorcism. Your level 87 ability looks to see probably really infrequent use. It's just a Dazzle, which is like a disorient, so it breaks on damage. However, you can glyph for it to knock the enemies down for 3 seconds instead of having the 6-second duration on that disorient. Whatever. If you like this vid or others on my site, you can help support me by liking, favoriting, subscribing, and even commenting. I'll try to respond best I can. And thanks for all the support, guys. I really do appreciate it.